When my husband walked into my 62nd birthday party, holding another woman's hand, the entire room went dead silent. Over 100 guests froze, their eyes tracking the two of them. Family, friends, lifelong business partners. Everyone watched as Michael Ferguson smiled and introduced a 39-year-old woman named Sabrina, announcing that she was incredibly important to his future. He expected tears. He expected me to be humiliated. But what he never saw coming was for me to calmly walk up to the stage, pull a sealed envelope from my purse, and slide it right into his hand. The exact second he opened it, the smile completely vanished from his face. Inside were divorce papers, and that was only the very beginning of what I had planned. Before we go any further, I'd love to hear your thoughts. If you were in my shoes that night, what would you have done? Would you have walked away quietly, or confronted him in front of everyone? Let me know in the comments, and if stories about strength, betrayal, and reclaiming your life resonate with you, please leave a like and subscribe. It really means a lot. Also, tell me where you're watching from and what time it is for you. I always love reading your messages. My name is Christine Ferguson. For most of my life, I truly believed I had a marriage that would last until my very last breath. Looking back now, I realize just how dangerous that kind of faith can be. When you spend decades loving someone, building a life together, and making sacrifices for them, you stop imagining a future without them. You stop questioning things. You stop protecting yourself because you are absolutely certain the person beside you would never hurt you. For 35 whole years, that was exactly how I felt about my husband, Michael. We met when I was 26 and he was 28 at a small community fundraiser in Charleston, South Carolina. Back then, I was a junior accountant at a local firm, and Michael was a project manager for a construction company. He wasn't wealthy, he wasn't powerful, and he wasn't even particularly successful yet, but he was incredibly charming. Michael had this way of making you feel like you were the only person in the room. When he spoke to you, he looked right into your eyes, as if nothing else in the world mattered. At least back then, it really felt that way. 3 years later, we were married. I still remember our wedding day so clearly. We couldn't afford anything lavish. My dress was simple, the reception was in the church hall, and most of the food was made by our families. But I was so happy. I genuinely believed I had found my partner for life. In those early years, money was always tight. There were months when we scrambled just to pay the bills, months when the fridge looked completely empty, and months when I secretly skipped meals just to make sure Michael had enough to eat after working long hours. I never told him about that. I didn't want him to carry that burden. When our son Ethan was born, things got even tighter. 3 years later, our daughter, Lauren, arrived. Suddenly we had 2 kids, a mortgage, and more responsibility than either of us had anticipated. But somehow we kept moving forward. What made those years bearable was knowing we were facing everything as a team. Or at least, that's what I thought. One night, Michael came home with an idea that would change everything. He wanted to start his own construction company. Most people thought he was crazy. We had very little savings, 2 young kids, and debt, with absolutely no guarantee of success. Even my parents thought it was too big a risk. But I believed in him. I always believed in him. I remember sitting at the kitchen table late at night while the kids were asleep upstairs. Michael spreading his business plans across the surface, his hands trembling slightly from a mix of nerves and excitement. "What if I fail?" he asked. I reached out, took his hand and said, "Then we fail together." I meant every single word. What happened next is something a lot of people never knew. To help Michael launch Ferguson Development Group, I put my own career on hold. I cut back my hours at the firm, and eventually, I left my accounting job entirely. I handled all the bookkeeping for the company from home. I tracked expenses, prepared financial statements, managed payroll, filed taxes, and answered client calls. In the early days when money was too tight to hire help, I did it all by myself. There were so many nights I worked until 2 a.m. after putting the kids to bed, only to get up at 6 to start all over again. I wasn't just Michael's wife, I was his business partner, his backbone, and his safety net. When the company needed extra funding, I even agreed to use the inheritance my late grandmother left me as collateral for a loan. That decision terrified me. If the business failed, we could lose almost everything. But Michael made me a promise. "I will never forget what you've done for me," he said. Those words stayed with me for years. Whenever things got hard, I would repeat them to myself. Eventually, the sacrifices paid off. The company grew, then expanded even more. New contracts came in, more employees were hired, and the revenue started climbing. For the first time in our lives, we felt financially secure. We moved into a beautiful home just outside of Charleston. It wasn't a mansion, but it had a gorgeous front porch overlooking the water. The exact kind of house we used to think only wealthy people could afford. I remember standing in the backyard one afternoon, watching Ethan and Lauren play, when Michael wrapped his arms around me from behind. "We made it," he whispered. At that moment, I believed him. Years passed. The kids grew up. Ethan got his business degree and built a successful career in corporate consulting. Lauren became a school teacher. I was so incredibly proud of both of them. Our family wasn't perfect. No family is. But from the outside, we looked happy, successful, stable, and deeply blessed. We were the kind of couple young people would point to and say, "I hope we're like them one day." If anyone had told me back then that my marriage would eventually fall apart in front of hundreds of people, I would have laughed. I would have thought they were losing their mind, because even as Michael became more and more successful, I never once doubted his loyalty. Not even for a second. I trusted him completely. Maybe that was my mistake. The initial changes were subtle, so subtle that I managed to ignore them. Michael started spending more time at the office. At first, it seemed completely justified. The company was expanding, and more projects meant more responsibility. I understood. Then came the business trips, then the late-night meetings, and then this persistent distance whenever we were actually together. At the dinner table, his mind always seemed to be somewhere else. His phone was always right next to him, and his attention was rarely on me. Even so, I made excuses for him. I told myself he was stressed, busy, and overworked. I wanted to believe those excuses because the alternative was just too painful to face. One night, I was talking about our plans for our upcoming wedding anniversary. Michael looked up from his phone, his eyes completely blank. "What?" he asked. I had already repeated myself twice. That moment only lasted a few seconds, but something deep inside me shifted. For the first time in 35 years, I felt completely alone sitting right next to my husband. I didn't know it yet, but that feeling was the beginning of everything. The beginning of the questions, the secrets, and the truths I never wanted to discover. Soon enough, I would learn that the man I had spent my entire life trusting was no longer the man I thought I knew. For a long time, I convinced myself that everything was fine. That's what a lot of women do when they've been married for decades. We look for excuses for the warning signs because accepting the truth is far more terrifying than ignoring it. At least, that's what I did. Michael's changes didn't happen overnight. They came slowly, showing up bit by bit. First, it was the late nights, then the business trips, followed by the constant distraction. But eventually, the small details became impossible to ignore. One morning, I noticed Michael standing in front of the bathroom mirror longer than usual. He was checking his hair, not just combing it, but examining it closely. A week later, I noticed he started dyeing the grey out of it. This was a man who used to joke about getting older, but suddenly he seemed obsessed with looking younger. The month after that, new clothes started appearing in our closet. Designer shirts, expensive shoes, custom jackets. Michael had never cared much about fashion before. For most of our marriage, I practically had to beg him to replace his worn-out clothes. Now he was spending hundreds of dollars without saying a word. "New shirt?" I asked one evening. He barely looked up. "Just something for a client meeting." The answer sounded reasonable enough, but then the next week there was another new shirt and then another. Soon he looked more like a man preparing for a first date than a husband of 35 years. The gym became another mystery. Michael had never enjoyed working out. Suddenly he was going 5 mornings a week, sometimes even 6. He bought expensive workout clothes, protein supplements, and even hired a personal trainer. I tried to laugh it off to hide my anxiety. "Trying to impress someone," I teased one morning. For a split second, his expression changed. Just for a single second, I saw it. Then he smiled. Maybe I'm just trying to impress my wife. I smiled back, but his answer felt rehearsed, like a line he had already prepared just in case I asked. The most glaring change, though, was his phone. For decades, neither of us cared about passwords. If my phone rang, Michael would answer it. If his rang, I would pick it up. There were no secrets. At least, there didn't used to be. Then one afternoon, I picked up his phone from the kitchen counter because it kept buzzing. I wasn't snooping. I just wanted to hand it to him. The screen lit up. Passcode required.
I froze. Michael had never locked his phone before. When he walked into the room, I casually brought it up.
Oh, it's a new company policy, he answered immediately. Security protocols. Again, the explanation sounded plausible, and yet something deep down inside me whispered otherwise. Over the next few months, I noticed a new pattern. Michael never let his phone leave his sight. If he went to the restroom, the phone went with him. If he walked outside to grab the mail, the phone went with him. Even if he fell asleep on the couch, the phone remained tucked firmly in his pocket. That level of secrecy felt incredibly unnatural, especially for a man who had lived transparently for decades. One evening, the two of us were having dinner alone. Lauren had moved into her own place years ago, and Ethan was living in Atlanta. The house felt much quieter than it used to. I was talking about a charity event I was planning to attend. Midway through, I realized Michael wasn't listening at all. His eyes were fixed on his phone under the edge of the table. He was smiling. It wasn't a polite or casual smile. It was a private smile. The kind people have when they are reading a message from someone who makes them feel excited. My stomach tightened. Michael?
No response.
Michael? He looked up. What's wrong? I stared at him. I've been talking for 5 minutes. He sighed dramatically. You don't need to make everything into a huge deal, Christine. Those words hit harder than I expected. It wasn't just that they were dismissive. It was the attitude, as if my feelings had become an inconvenience. As if I had become an inconvenience. For the first time in my life, I went to bed angry. And for the first time, Michael didn't seem to care at all. The distance between us kept growing. Every conversation became shorter, and every interaction grew colder. Then came the subtle remarks. At first, they sounded harmless enough. You're lucky you don't have to worry about work anymore. Or, most women your age would love to have this lifestyle, and you should just relax and enjoy retirement. Those comments bothered me because they completely erased reality. I hadn't spent my life just relaxing. I had helped build everything we owned, every dollar, every success, every opportunity. Yet, the way Michael spoke made it sound more and more like he had built it all entirely on his own. One afternoon, I confronted him about it. Not with anger, but just completely honestly. Do you feel like I don't contribute anything to this family? His reaction shocked me. Instead of reassuring me, he laughed. A genuine, dismissive laugh. Oh, come on, Christine. The laugh only lasted a moment, but I will never forget it. I will never forget how small it made me feel. Around that same time, Ethan came home for a weekend visit. While Michael was away on yet another business trip, we sat out on the porch talking. I finally shared a few of my concerns. Not everything, just a little bit, to see how he would react. To my surprise, Ethan immediately defended his father. Dad's under a lot of pressure, Mum. I know he is. He runs a major company, I get it. You might just be overthinking things. That last sentence stung deeply because it sounded exactly like something Michael would say. I forced a smile. Maybe Ethan was right. Maybe I was just imagining things. Maybe I was becoming paranoid. That's what I told myself at the time. Lauren's reaction was completely different. A few weeks later, she and I grabbed lunch. The moment she saw my face, she knew something was wrong. What's going on, Mom? I hesitated, but then I told her everything. The late nights, the secrecy, the emotional distance, the phone, the coldness. Lauren listened quietly. When I finished, she stared down at her coffee. That was the moment I noticed a detail. She didn't look surprised.
My heart started racing.
Lauren, she looked up. Do you know something? Her eyes were filled with uncertainty. I don't know anything for sure. That wasn't a denial.
Lauren.
She swallowed hard. I've just noticed he's changed too.
A chill ran straight through me. For weeks after that, I couldn't stop thinking about that conversation. If Lauren had noticed it too, then maybe I wasn't just imagining things. Maybe something was genuinely deeply wrong. The confirmation came on a rainy Tuesday afternoon. Michael had left for what he claimed was a 3-day business conference in Charlotte. I was in the Home Office organising some paperwork when I accidentally noticed an unfamiliar envelope tucked between a couple of folders. Under normal circumstances, I might have ignored it, but some deep instinct urged me to pick it up. Inside was a printed receipt. At first it looked ordinary. Then I saw the location.
A luxury resort in Savannah, Georgia. Not Charlotte. Savannah.
My hands began to shake. I checked the dates. The booking aligned perfectly with Michael's recent business trip. 2 guests, a luxury suite, 3 nights.
I stared at that piece of paper for what felt like an eternity. A part of me desperately wanted there to be an innocent explanation. A mistake? A misunderstanding? Anything. But deep down, I already knew the truth. For months, my instincts had been trying to warn me, and now I finally had proof. While it wasn't the final definitive evidence of everything, it was absolute proof that Michael had lied. And once a partner starts hiding where they are, the questions that follow become terrifying.
Who was he with? How long had this been going on? And most importantly, who was worth risking a 35-year marriage for? After discovering the resort receipt, I didn't confront Michael right away. That might surprise some people. If this had happened when I was younger, I probably would have demanded an explanation immediately. I would have thrown the receipt in his face and made him account for every single lie. But after 35 years of marriage, something strange happens. You become afraid to hear the answer. As long as I stayed silent, there was still a tiny microscopic chance that I was mistaken. A tiny chance that an explanation existed that I just couldn't see. The moment I confronted him, that possibility would vanish forever. So instead of exposing him, I chose to wait and observe. For the first time in my life, I began watching my husband the way an investigator watches a suspect. It was a heartbreaking experience, because once I started paying close attention, I saw so many things I hadn't noticed for months, maybe even years. Michael became fiercely protective of his work schedule. Whenever I casually asked about meetings or projects, his answers were always incredibly vague. Just business. Nothing special. The usual. Yet, he was away longer than ever before. One evening, he claimed he was having dinner with investors. 3 hours later, I checked the company's social media page. There were photos from the investor event. Michael wasn't in any of them. That was the first time I could confirm he was outright lying. After midnight, I sat alone in the kitchen. I remember staring out the dark window above the sink. My reflection looked so much older than I remembered. Exhausted, anxious, heartbroken. I asked the one question I had been avoiding for months. What if Michael is having an affair? The words felt like poison. Just thinking them made me sick to my stomach, because if the answer was yes, it meant everything I believed about my marriage was built on a lie. A few days later, I decided I needed facts, not assumptions. Facts. I wasn't interested in a dramatic confrontation. I wanted the truth. The whole truth. The opportunity arrived completely unexpectedly. Michael left his laptop open in the home office while he stepped out. Normally, I never touched his work equipment, but that day I made an exception. I told myself I was just looking for answers, nothing more. The computer wasn't password protected. Within minutes, I found dozens of emails related to the company's operations. Most of it was routine. Contracts, invoices, scheduled discussions. Then I noticed a name appearing frequently. Sabrina Hayes. I'd never heard of her before. At first, it didn't seem unusual. Her title was listed as Director of Business Development. Apparently, Michael had hired her about a year ago. But the more I read, the stranger things became. Her role seemed unusually prominent, far beyond what someone who had just joined the company should have. She was copied on confidential correspondence, included in executive discussions, and invited to meetings usually restricted to senior leadership. Even more surprising, several senior managers seemed to resent her influence. One email caught my attention immediately. A department head had written, "Since Sabrina doesn't have an accounting or operational background, why is she attending the financial strategy meetings?" Michael's reply was incredibly brief. "Because I trust her judgment." I read that sentence 3 times. Because I trust her judgment. The phrasing felt deeply personal, not professional. My stomach did a complete flip. Over the next week, I quietly continued gathering information. I never thought I'd be doing something like this, but every new discovery pushed me further. One afternoon, I dropped by the company headquarters under the excuse of delivering some documents. The receptionist greeted me warmly. Most of the long-term staff still remembered the years I spent working there. As I walked through the executive wing, I noticed a framed photo hanging on the wall from a recent company retreat. Dozens of employees were standing by a lakeside resort. My eyes locked onto Michael immediately, and then I saw her. Sabrina was standing right next to him, closer than any employee should be standing to a married CEO. Her hand was resting lightly on his arm. Most people might not have noticed that detail, but I did, because a wife always notices. She was beautiful, painfully so. Tall, blonde, elegant, the kind of woman who commands attention the second she enters a room. The kind of woman who can make an aging man feel young again.
For several seconds, I just stared at that photo. It wasn't because I hated her, not yet. It was because I suddenly understood what I was up against. This wasn't a temporary mistake or a one-night lapse in judgment. This was something much deeper.
A few days later, fate handed me another piece of the puzzle. My friend Diane had been downtown for a charity luncheon. When she called me that evening, her voice sounded hesitant.
"Christine, can I ask you something?"
Of course. There was a long pause on the line, then she spoke. Was Michael supposed to be in Savannah last month? The question sent my pulse spiking instantly. Why do you ask? Another pause. I don't know if I should even bring this up. My heart sank. Diane, please. I saw him. The room felt like it was spinning. Where? At a resort just outside of Savannah. I closed my eyes. The receipt, the lies, the missing business trips. Everything clicked together instantly. Was he alone? I asked quietly. Diane hesitated, and that brief hesitation told me everything. No. My chest tightened. Who was with him? I don't know her name. But even before Diane described her, I already knew. Young, blonde, stylish, confident, beautiful. Sabrina Hayes. After the call ended, I sat in the silence alone. I should have cried. I should have screamed. Instead, I felt a strange sense of calm, because for the first time in months, I wasn't chasing suspicions anymore. I was looking directly at reality. Reality hurt, but the uncertainty had hurt worse. Over the next few weeks, I learned even more. Through public company events, social media photos, and professional networking pages, Sabrina was everywhere. Everywhere Michael appeared, she was right there with him. Golf outings, fundraisers, business conferences, award dinners. She was always close by, always smiling, always looking far too comfortable around a married man. The final confirmation came from Lauren, who didn't even realize what she was confirming. She came over to the house one evening. We were having tea in the kitchen when she casually mentioned seeing her father at a restaurant a few weeks prior. Who was he with? I asked. Lauren's expression changed instantly. That reaction alone was enough of an answer. My heart sank. You saw her, didn't you? Lauren looked down at the table and slowly nodded. Tears welled up in her eyes. I didn't know what to do, Mum. The pain in her voice broke my heart because she had been carrying this weight all on her own. I didn't want to hurt you. I reached across the table and took her hand. Neither of us spoke for a long time. When she finally left that night, I sat in the dark, alone. The truth was no longer just a possibility. It was a settled fact. Michael Ferguson was having an affair. The man I had loved for 35 years, the man I had sacrificed my dreams for, the man I trusted with my entire life, had chosen another woman. As devastating as that realization was, another, even more unsettling question began to form in my mind. Because the more I learned about Sabrina Hayes, the more something felt off. This didn't look like love. This looked like ambition. She wasn't just getting close to Michael. She was getting close to the company, the financials, the decision-making, the future. Deep down, I couldn't shake the feeling that Sabrina Hayes wanted far more than just my husband. Learning that my husband was having an affair broke my heart, but discovering that my family might not fully stand by me almost completely shattered my spirit. Looking back now, I think that was the exact moment I truly understood how isolated I had become. It wasn't due to a lack of people who loved me. but because the ones closest to me were terrified of facing the truth. And fear can make good people do incredibly disappointing things. For nearly 2 weeks after confirming Michael's affair, I didn't tell a soul except Lauren. I carried the burden completely alone. Every morning I woke up next to the man who had betrayed me. Every evening I sat across from him at the dinner table. Every conversation felt like a performance, and every smile felt like a lie. Michael appeared completely at ease, which hurt more than anything else. He didn't act like a man burdened by guilt. He seemed entirely unconcerned about losing his marriage. If anything, he looked more confident than ever, as if he believed he had everything perfectly under control.
One evening, he announced he was heading out of town for another conference. I simply nodded. The old me would have asked questions. The current me stayed silent.
Michael studied my face. Are you okay? After months of lies, that question felt almost dark. Now he wanted to know if I was okay. I'm fine. He seemed relieved and went right back to checking his phone. I watched him for a few seconds. For the first time in 35 years, I didn't recognize the man sitting across from me. That realization was devastating. A few days later, I called Ethan. I knew it would be a difficult conversation, but I needed to know where my son stood. He came over to the house on a Saturday afternoon. The weather was beautiful, with the sun reflecting off the water behind the house. Under different circumstances, it would have been a peaceful day. Instead, I felt physically ill from anxiety. We sat together on the back porch. For several minutes, we talked about trivial things. Work, traffic, sports. Neither of us wanted to address the real issue. Finally, I forced myself to speak.
Ethan, I need to tell you something.
He immediately looked concerned. What's wrong? I took a deep breath. I have reason to believe your father is having an affair. The sentence hung in the air between us. His reaction was swift, but completely unexpected. He frowned and shook his head. No way. The certainty in his voice startled me. I have reasons to know it's true. They wouldn't do something like that.
The irony almost made me want to laugh, because I had said those exact same words before.
I have proof, Ethan. Ethan crossed his arms. What kind of proof? I told him everything. The resort receipt, the lies, the woman named Sabrina, the photos, the restaurant sighting. When I finished, he just stared out at the water. For a brief second, I thought he finally understood. Instead, he let out a long sigh. Even if all of that is true, those words stung like a knife. Even if it's true, you don't know the whole story. What whole story could possibly justify this? I'm not saying it justifies it. And what are you saying? Ethan hesitated, then said something I will never forget. Maybe you should think carefully about this before you ruin the entire family. I stared at him, completely speechless for several seconds. It wasn't because I was angry, it was because I was hurt, deeply hurt. His message was loud and clear. Protect the family, protect the reputation, protect the business, but apparently protecting me was not the priority. I spent my entire life protecting this family, I said softly. I know you have. Did you actually hear what I just told you? His eyes softened slightly. Of course I did, Mom. Then why does it feel like you're defending him? Ethan looked incredibly uncomfortable because he knew I was right. And yet, he still couldn't bring himself to fully condemn his father. Finally, he stood up. Just promise me you'll think about things before you make any major decisions. After he left, I sat on the porch alone for nearly an hour. I wasn't entirely angry with Ethan. I understood his position. Michael wasn't just my husband. He was Ethan's father, a man he looked up to, someone who had helped shape his life. Accepting the truth would force Ethan to reevaluate everything he believed about his dad, and that kind of realization doesn't happen overnight. Still, the conversation left me feeling more isolated than ever before. Lauren's reaction was completely different. She came over for dinner a few days later, and the moment she walked into the kitchen, she knew something had happened. You talked to Ethan, didn't you? I nodded. Her expression darkened instantly. He defended Dad, didn't he? I nodded again. Lauren shook her head. I knew he would. The sadness in her voice was palpable. Unlike Ethan, Lauren didn't see the world in simple black and white terms. She understood how complicated people could be, and she had seen enough to know that things were already incredibly bad. I don't know what to do anymore, I admitted. The confession surprised even me. For most of my life, I had been the strong one, the stable one, the fixer. Now, I felt completely lost. Lauren reached across the table and squeezed my hand. "Mum," I looked up. "You don't deserve this." Those words almost broke me, because it was the first time anyone had said them to me. I felt tears welling up in my eyes. It wasn't because she had solved my problems, but because she acknowledged my pain. Sometimes that is enough. We sat in silence for a few minutes. Then Lauren asked a crucial question. "What do you want?" I opened my mouth to speak, then stopped because I honestly didn't know. Did I want Michael to come home and confess? Did I want him to beg for forgiveness? Did I want him to end the affair? Or did I just want my old life back? The reality was far more complicated. The thing I wanted most was already impossible to have. I wanted to restore 35 years of trust. I wanted the certainty back, and I wanted the innocence we used to share. But none of that could happen. Once trust is broken, something fundamental changes, and it can never be fully restored, even if a marriage survives. The following week, another event forced me to face a painful reality. Michael and I attended a charity fundraiser together. Throughout the evening, he barely acknowledged me, choosing instead to spend most of his time talking with business associates. At one point, I approached a circle where a group conversation was happening. The moment I joined, Michael interrupted the flow. "We're just discussing company strategy, Christine." The implication was clear. This isn't a conversation you belong in. The humiliation was subtle, but entirely unmistakable. Years ago, I was the one who helped build that very company. Now, Michael was treating me like an outsider, someone who didn't understand anything. On the drive home that night, I stared out the passenger window. Michael talked about business opportunities as if everything was perfectly fine, as if he hadn't been lying to me for months, as if our marriage wasn't crumbling beneath the surface. It was the exact moment I finally had a revelation. Michael wasn't worried at all about losing me. He believed down to his core that I would stay. After 35 years of sacrifice, loyalty, and forgiveness, he assumed I would tolerate anything. The affair, the lies, the disrespect, all of it. For the first time in my life, I began to realize that walking away might be the only language he actually understood. But before I made any decisions, I needed answers. Real answers, not guesses or suspicions. I needed to know exactly what Michael was doing, and more importantly, what he was hiding. Because deep down, I had a growing feeling that the affair was only part of the story.
Everything changed the moment I stopped thinking like a wife and started thinking like an accountant. For months I had been focused entirely on the affair, the lies, the betrayal, and the emotional hurt. But after talking with Ethan and Lauren, I began to look at the situation through a different lens. Michael wasn't just my husband. He was also the CEO of a company I had once helped build from scratch. And if there was one thing I understood better than most, it was paperwork.
Numbers really lie. People do. The following Monday morning, I called a lawyer named Rebecca Lawson. A friend who had gone through a difficult divorce years ago had highly recommended her to me. When I walked into her office, I felt incredibly nervous. It wasn't because I doubted my choice, but because walking into that building felt like an admission that my marriage was truly in jeopardy. Rebecca welcomed me warmly. In her early 50s, confident and composed, she was the kind of woman who instantly made you feel safe. After listening to me speak for nearly an hour, she leaned back in her chair.
"Christine, I need to ask you something."
"Of course. In the early days of the company, how involved were you?" I almost laughed. "Very involved. Can you be specific?"
So, I told her. I explained how I had handled the bookkeeping, the payroll, the tax records, the loan applications, the financial planning, and the vendor accounts. Everything. I described how I had used my inheritance as collateral when the business was struggling. I described signing documents that many spouses might never even see.
Rebecca listened intently. Then she asked another question. "Do you still have copies of those records?" I blinked. "Some of them."
I couldn't find them. The seriousness in her voice caught my attention.
"Why?" She folded her hands. "Because I think your husband might have forgotten a few things." It was the first time that day I felt an emotion other than sadness. Curiosity. That night, I began searching through old storage bins in the home office. Years of records filled file cabinets and closets. A lot of people might have thrown those papers away, but I never did. The accountant in me kept everything. By midnight, my dining table was completely covered in folders. Loan agreements, corporate filings, property records, tax returns, and ownership documents. Some were over 20 years old, dating back to the very beginning of Ferguson Development Group. As I went through the papers, memories came rushing back. Every risk, every sacrifice, every sleepless night, every decision Michael and I had made together. The deeper I looked, the more I realized something crucial. A lot of the assets were tied to me, not just by marriage, but legally, directly. Several properties acquired during the company's early expansion still carried documentation tying them to my guarantees. In some cases, my signature sat right next to Michael's. In others, my financial history had been the key to getting the loans approved in the first place. I wasn't just a wife, I was a vital piece of the foundation.
Discovering this gave me a strange sense of strength. For months, Michael had made me feel completely irrelevant, but these documents told a completely different story.
2 days later, I returned to Rebecca's office with several boxes. She spent hours reviewing the files, getting more and more intrigued as she went. Finally, she looked up. "This is substantial, Christine." "What do you mean?" "The role you played is far greater than that of a typical spouse." I nodded. "I know. And does Michael know this paper trail still exists?" I thought about it, then shook my head. Probably not. Michael rarely looked backward at old records. He was focused on the future, the next contract, the next deal, the next opportunity. Meanwhile, I had quietly preserved decades of history. Rebecca suggested bringing in an independent financial expert, a forensic accountant, someone who could look closely at the firm's activities. A week later, I met Nathan Cole. In his mid-40s, Nathan had years of experience investigating financial disputes. After assessing the situation, he agreed to help. The investigation started slowly. At first, Nathan requested public records, corporate filings, property transactions, and business registrations. Nothing unusual. Then, he started asking deeper questions. Questions I couldn't answer. Things only Michael would know. However, one discovery stood out immediately. There were a few recent transactions that looked unusual. Not necessarily illegal, but highly uncommon. Capital was moving differently than in previous years. Funds were being transferred between accounts more frequently. A few consulting fees were larger than expected. Some vendor relationships looked structured strangely as well. Nathan never jumped to conclusions, and neither did Rebecca, but they both encouraged me to keep gathering information. As the weeks passed, I began watching Michael even more closely. For the first time, I noticed him spending large amounts of time reviewing financial reports at home, something he rarely used to do. He would lock himself in his office for hours. If I entered the room unexpectedly, he would instantly minimize his computer screen, close files, or change the subject. The behavior was incredibly suspicious.
One evening, I casually asked how the business was going.
"Great," he said immediately. "Any challenges?" "None at all." The answer came too quickly, almost like a rehearsed line. I watched him carefully. The man sitting across from me looked confident, but he didn't look relaxed. There was a tension beneath the surface. Something was weighing on his mind. I could tell. The following month brought another surprising discovery. While sorting through older files, I located copies of the original loan agreements from nearly 3 decades ago. One specific clause caught my eye immediately. Several properties used as collateral during the early expansion were still tied to liabilities that had never been officially restructured. I wasn't sure what it meant legally, but Rebecca certainly would. When I showed her the papers, her interest was clear. "This could have a major impact," she said.
How major?
"Very major." My heart rate accelerated. For the first time since discovering the affair, I felt a sense of something resembling confidence. It wasn't because I wanted revenge, but because I was beginning to see the truth clearly. For months, Michael had treated me like someone with no power, as someone completely oblivious to what was happening, an aging wife who would just accept his choices silently. But he had forgotten one thing. Before I was his wife, I was an accountant. Before he built his company, I helped lay the groundwork. And unlike Michael, I never forgot a single detail. One afternoon, Nathan called me. His voice sounded unusually serious. Christine, I found something. My stomach tightened. What is it? I need to verify a few more records before I can give you a definitive conclusion. That wasn't exactly reassuring. What are you seeing, Nathan? After a brief pause, he answered. There are several fund transfers that don't quite align with recent commercial activities. I waited, and I think your husband might be preparing for something. A chill ran down my spine. Preparing for what? I don't know yet. But deep down, I already suspected the answer. Michael wasn't just having an affair. He wasn't just lying. He was planning, preparing, and positioning pieces on a board I hadn't even realized we were playing on. If my instincts were correct, the affair was just one part of a much larger strategy, a strategy that could affect our marriage, our assets, and everything we had spent 35 years building together. For the first time in my life, I realized I wasn't just uncovering betrayal. I was uncovering a plan. And whatever Michael Ferguson was planning, I was going to expose it before he could make his next move.
The strangest thing about betrayal is that once you finally see it for what it is, the fear starts to fade. Not all at once, and not completely, but bit by bit. The woman who used to cry herself to sleep for months began to change. The wife, who had been terrified of losing her marriage at all costs, started asking a completely different question. What exactly am I fighting so hard to save?
Because the marriage, I thought, I had no longer existed. The trust was gone, the honesty was gone, and the partnership was gone. All that remained was an illusion, and Michael seemed determined to keep that illusion alive for as long as possible. 3 weeks after Nathan warned me about the suspicious financial activity, Michael surprised me with an announcement. We were having breakfast, and he casually set his coffee cup down. I booked the Grand Harbour Ballroom, he said. I looked up. Booked it for what? Grand Harbour. I raised an eyebrow. In Charleston, everyone knows the Grand Harbour Hotel. It's one of the most prestigious venues in the city, expensive, elegant, and favoured by wealthy business owners and politicians. For what occasion?
Michael smiled. For your birthday.
I stared at him. My birthday? You're turning 62. I know. I think we should celebrate properly. For a moment, I was genuinely confused. This was a man who barely remembered our wedding anniversary anymore. A man who had abandoned me emotionally for months. Now, he wanted to host a lavish birthday party. It didn't make sense. And when something doesn't make sense, there's usually a reason behind it. That seems unnecessary, Michael. Nonsense. The smile on his face was perfectly executed. We'll invite family, friends, clients, and business partners. Clients and business partners. There was the first clue. This wasn't about my birthday at all. This was about having an audience. At the time, I didn't know exactly what Michael was planning, but I knew enough to be incredibly cautious. The following week, I received another unexpected phone call, this time from George Whitman. George had known Michael and me for over 25 years. He was one of the original investors in the company and one of the few people who had been involved from the very beginning. Unlike a lot of business partners, George had always treated me as an equal. He remembered the years I spent working right alongside Michael, back before the success changed everything. Christine, he said softly, can we meet up? Something in his tone instantly made me uneasy. 2 days later, we sat in a small seafood restaurant overlooking the marina. George looked incredibly uncomfortable, and from that alone, I knew the conversation wouldn't be pleasant. After a few minutes of small talk, he finally cut straight to the chase. I don't like what's happening right now, Christine. My stomach tightened. What do you mean, George? George sighed. I mean, Michael. I stayed silent. He's making decisions that concern me. What kind of decisions? George hesitated, then leaned forward. How much do you know about Sabrina Hayes? There was that name again. The name that seemed to be everywhere lately. Enough, I said. George nodded slowly. Then you probably know she's been attending executive meetings. I've heard she's attending more than just meetings. My heart rate picked up. What is this really about, George? George looked around the restaurant before continuing. Michael is positioning her for a significant future leadership role. For a few seconds, I couldn't even speak. Leadership? Sabrina? A woman who had been there for barely a year? George continued. The senior management team is furious. Why? Because she doesn't have the experience. I already knew that part. Then why is Michael doing it? George gave me a sad look. The answer was glaringly obvious. Neither of us needed to say it out loud, because Michael wasn't making business decisions anymore. He was making emotional ones. And emotional decisions in business are usually incredibly costly. George reached into his briefcase, pulled out a few documents, and slid them across the table. I looked down. Meeting agendas, strategic planning sessions, executive retreats. Sabrina's name was all over them, appearing far more frequently than it should have for any new employee. George, he cut me off. I'm telling you this because I feel like you're being pushed out, Christine. Those words landed like a physical blow. It wasn't because I hadn't considered the possibility, but hearing someone else say it made it incredibly real. For months I had been focused on the affair, but now a much darker possibility was emerging. What if Michael wasn't just trying to replace me emotionally? What if he wanted to replace me entirely, in every single way? As a wife, as a partner, and as a part of the company's history. The thought made me feel physically sick. That night, I met with Rebecca and Nathan. We reviewed everything we had gathered so far. The affair, the financial irregularities, the information from George, the unusual fund transfers, and Sabrina's expanding role. Rebecca listened carefully. When we finished, she folded her hands. Christine, I think you need to be prepared. Prepared for what? A legal battle. The words hung heavily in the air. I looked at Nathan, and he nodded in agreement. I concur. If it had been a month ago, hearing that would have terrified me. But now, it just confirmed what I already suspected. Michael was preparing for something, and whatever it was, I needed to be ready too. The next few days were a whirlwind of preparation. Rebecca began organizing documentation. Nathan continued tracking the financial records, and I gathered every piece of information I could find. The process was exhausting, but it was also incredibly empowering. For the first time in months, I felt like I was taking control of my own future, not just reacting to things, but actively planning.
One afternoon, Rebecca called. I have your documents ready.
I knew exactly what she meant. The divorce papers, the official legal document that would end a 35-year marriage. Neither of us spoke for a few seconds. Then I said softly, "Okay." The next day, I went to her office. She handed me a sealed envelope. It looked simple and completely ordinary, yet it felt heavier than in anything I had ever held. I stared at it for a long time. Inside that envelope was the end of one chapter of my life, and the beginning of another. "Do you want to file them now?" Rebecca asked. I shook my head. "Not yet." She looked surprised. "Why?" I thought about Michael, about Sabrina, about the lies, and about the humiliation I had faced. Then I thought about the upcoming birthday party. An idea had been slowly forming in my mind for weeks, and now it was completely clear. Michael hadn't organized that event for me. He had done it for himself, for his image, for his future, and for whatever announcement he intended to make. Suddenly I knew exactly what I wanted to do. I slid the envelope into my purse. Rebecca studied my face closely. "What are you thinking, Christine?" I looked right at her. "I'm thinking Michael wanted an audience." A slight smile appeared on Rebecca's face. I smiled back. "So, I think I'll give him one." For the first time since discovering the affair, I felt a genuine sense of peace. It wasn't because my problems were solved, or because the pain had vanished, but because I finally had a plan. Michael believed he was controlling the narrative. He believed he was orchestrating the future. He believed I would remain silent, invisible, and entirely predictable. But what he didn't know was that I had decided exactly when our marriage was going to end. And if my instincts were correct, the Grand Harbour Ballroom was about to host a birthday celebration that the entire city of Charleston would never forget. The day of my birthday party, the weather was absolutely flawless. The sky over Charleston was a brilliant blue, and the harbour sparkled in the afternoon sun. People often say that when your life is about to change forever, you feel a strange shift in the air. They're right. The moment I opened my eyes that morning, I knew everything was going to be different. Not tomorrow, not next week, not next year. Today. By the time the night ended, my marriage would be over. And only one person in the entire city knew it. Me. Michael clearly had absolutely no idea. Throughout the morning, he played the part of the devoted husband perfectly. Shortly after breakfast, flowers arrived. A massive arrangement of white roses and lilies, my absolute favourites. Years ago, that gesture would have made my heart melt. Now it just felt like a performance. A show designed for an audience, not for me. "Happy birthday," Michael said as he kissed my cheek. I forced a smile. "Thank you." He looked incredibly pleased with himself, as if he had nailed the role. The irony almost made me want to laugh, because while Michael thought he was in total control of how this night would go, he had no idea what was sitting quietly inside my purse. The sealed envelope was right where I wanted it, patiently waiting. Around 4 in the afternoon, I started getting ready. I stood in front of the bedroom mirror and looked at myself for much longer than usual. It wasn't because I wanted to impress anyone, but because I wanted to remember this version of myself. The woman who still belonged to her old life, standing on the edge of the terrifying unknown. I chose a navy blue evening gown. Elegant, simple and classic. It was the kind of dress that made a statement without needing to shout. Once I finished, I examined my reflection. The woman looking back at me didn't look like the woman from 6 months ago. She looked stronger, sadder, and a lot wiser. There were a few more lines around her eyes, but there was also something else. Determination. The fearful wife was fading away, leaving behind a woman who was finally done apologizing for her own existence. By 6 o'clock, we arrived at the Grand Harbour Hotel. The ballroom was stunning. Crystal chandeliers hung from their high ceilings. Dozens of tables were draped in crisp white linens, and massive floor-to-ceiling windows overlooked the water. Flowers decorated every corner of the room, and hundreds of candles cast a warm, soft glow. It was beautiful. Painfully so, because beneath all that elegance lay a massive lie. Shortly after, guests began to arrive. Friends, relatives, business partners, community leaders, former employees. People I had known for decades, all believing they were there to celebrate a milestone birthday. I greeted every single one of them, smiling, thanking them for coming, and accepting hugs and well wishes. All the while, my mind remained focused on one single question. When would Michael make his move? Because I knew he hadn't spent all this money just to celebrate my birthday. After months of emotional distance, after the affair, after everything, he had an agenda, and I could feel it. By 7 o'clock, the ballroom was nearly full. Over 100 guests filled the space, the sound of laughter and conversation echoing through the room. Servers moved through the crowd with trays of champagne and hors d'oeuvres, and a live jazz band played softly near the stage. From the outside, everything looked absolutely perfect. Then Ethan arrived. My son looked handsome as always in a dark suit, but I noticed something unusual immediately. He looked nervous, distracted, and completely ill at ease. "Happy birthday, Mom," he said, hugging me tightly, holding on a little longer than usual. I stepped back and studied his face. "Is everything okay, Ethan?" "Of course." The answer came too quickly, just like the answers his father always gave. I felt a small knot form in my stomach. Before I could ask anything else, Lauren arrived. Unlike Ethan, she walked straight over and gave me a real hug. The kind that communicates love without needing a single word. "You look absolutely beautiful, Mom," she whispered. "Thank you, sweetheart." She looked at me for a long moment. For a split second, I wondered if she somehow sensed what was coming. If she did, she didn't say a word. As the evening progressed, I noticed another detail. People kept glancing toward the entrance. Business associates, senior managers, company executives. It was almost as if they were waiting for a VIP to arrive. That observation caught my attention instantly because the guest of honor was already here. Me. So, who exactly were they waiting for? The answer came 20 minutes later. The doors to the ballroom opened, the chatter in the room softened, and heads began to turn. There she was, Sabrina Hayes. Even though I had seen photos of her before, seeing her in person felt completely different, more jarring, and incredibly real. She wore a stunning crimson evening gown that instantly drew every eye in the room. Her blonde hair fell perfectly over her shoulders, and she moved with an effortless confidence. It wasn't the confidence of an employee or a guest. It was the confidence of someone who believed she absolutely owned the place. My heart hammered against my ribs, but strangely, I felt a wave of calm wash over me. Because in that exact moment, any remaining doubt vanished completely. This wasn't a misunderstanding or an innocent professional relationship. No regular employee wears a dress like that to the birthday party of her married boss's wife. Whispers immediately began ripples through the room. People noticed. Of course they did. How could they not? Several guests exchanged confused looks, while others murmured quietly to one another. The atmosphere shifted subtly, but unmistakably. Then I witnessed the moment that made everything completely clear. Michael saw Sabrina from across the room, and the expression on his face transformed entirely. It wasn't dramatic, and most people probably missed it, but I didn't. His eyes lit up, his posture shifted, and his smile became completely genuine. The kind of smile I hadn't seen him direct at me in years. The realization hurt deeper than I expected. 35 years. 35 years together, and somehow I had become completely invisible. Michael immediately started walking across the room, not toward me, but straight toward her. I watched as they greeted each other, far too warmly, far too comfortably, and far too closely. A few executives standing nearby shifted uncomfortably, exchanging glances. George Whitman happened to be standing right next to me, and he leaned in quietly. "You see it now, don't you?" I didn't answer. I didn't need to, because we both knew. The entire room knew. The only person who didn't seem to realize how obvious it looked was Michael. Or maybe he just didn't care anymore. As the night went on, Sabrina continued to mingle through the crowd, introducing herself, talking with investors, chatting with clients, and laughing with executives. At one point, I overheard a woman ask who she was. The response sent a chill straight through me. Someone incredibly important to Michael. Not an employee, not a colleague, not a manager. Someone incredibly important to Michael. The phrasing felt deliberate, intentional, and strategic. It was the exact kind of phrase people use when they are laying the groundwork to announce something major. Suddenly I understood everything. Michael hadn't just brought Sabrina to the party to attend. He was showcasing her, introducing her, and bringing her into the world I had spent decades helping build, and he intended to do it completely publicly. The realization should have crushed me, but instead it solidified my resolve. Michael had just made a critical error. He believed tonight belonged to him. He believed he was controlling the narrative. He believed I would just stand by silently, watching him take my place in front of everyone who mattered. But what he didn't know was that the envelope inside my purse had already turned this night into something entirely different. I lightly touched the strap of my purse hanging over my shoulder. It was still there, waiting. On the other side of the room, Michael was laughing with Sabrina, confident, relaxed, and completely unaware that in less than an hour, the most humiliating moment of his life was about to begin. There are moments in life when time seems to slow down completely. Moments where every detail gets permanently etched into your memory. The next 40 minutes would become one of those moments. Even now, I can recall every single expression, every whisper, every glance, and every heartbeat. While the guests finished their dinner, the ballroom buzzed with conversation. Crystal glasses caught the candlelight, and the jazz band continued to play softly in the background. From a distance, everything looked elegant and civilized. But beneath the surface, tension was building, and I could feel it. Several people had already noticed the unusual dynamic between Michael and Sabrina. They weren't talking about it openly, but people notice far more than we think, especially in a room full of lifelong friends and business partners. By 8:30, dessert was served. That was the moment Michael stood up, and a member of the hotel staff immediately handed him a microphone. My heart rate accelerated. Here it was, the moment he had been planning for weeks, and the moment I had been waiting for. The chatter in the room began to quiet down. The ballroom went silent, and over 100 faces turned toward the stage. Michael smiled confidently, the charming smile that had made me fall in love with him, the smile that convinced clients to sign contracts, and the smile that had hidden months of deception. "Good evening, everyone." Polite applause rippled through the room. Michael looked around. "I want to thank you all for being here tonight." More applause. Then he turned toward me. "Most of all, I want to thank my wife, Christine." For a split second, I almost laughed. It wasn't because it was funny, but because it was absolutely absurd. Months of lies, months of betrayal, and now he wanted to publicly thank me. The performance continued. Michael spoke about our marriage, our family, the company, and the years we had shared. A few guests offered warm smiles, and a couple even looked genuinely touched. If only they knew the truth. Then his tone shifted. It was subtle at first, but I noticed it instantly. "Life is made up of different chapters," he said. My stomach tightened. "And sometimes we have to embrace change." A few people exchanged confused glances. Michael continued, "The future belongs to those who are willing to grow."
Here it came. This was the setup, the opening line, the beginning of whatever announcement he intended to make.
I glanced across the room. Sabrina was watching him intently. Her expression was calm, confident, and almost expectant, as if she knew exactly what was about to happen next. Michael smiled and extended his hand toward her. "Sabrina, would you mind coming up here for a moment?" The atmosphere in the room shifted instantly. A wave of unease rippled through the crowd. You could practically feel it physically. Confusion, curiosity, and concern. Sabrina rose from her seat elegantly. In the ballroom lighting, her crimson dress looked even more striking. She walked toward the stage, toward my husband, and toward the future she clearly believed belonged to her. The whispers started immediately. I could hear fragments of conversation around me. "What's going on? Why is she going up there? Isn't that the woman from his company? Oh my goodness." Michael either didn't notice the reactions or simply didn't care. Sabrina stood right beside him on the stage. Suddenly, the image was impossible to ignore. A successful, older businessman standing with a young, blonde executive while his wife sat down in the audience. The symbolism was glaring. Michael smiled again. "I want everyone to meet someone who has become incredibly important to me." Silence, complete, dead silence. Even the staff stopped moving. Nobody wanted to miss what was about to happen next. Michael looked directly at Sabrina, then turned back to the audience. Over the past year, Sabrina has brought immense value to Ferguson Development Group. A few executives shifted uncomfortably in their seats. George Whitman looked absolutely furious. Michael continued, "She has helped shape the future of our company." Company, future, important. The words sounded carefully chosen, very carefully. Then he delivered the line that finally pushed everything over the edge. "And I believe she will play a major role in the next chapter of my life." A collective gasp rippled through the entire ballroom. Not everyone gasped, but enough people did to make the reaction impossible to ignore. Michael had crossed a line, a very public line. I looked at Ethan. The colour had completely drained from his face. For the first time, my son seemed to understand exactly how serious this was. Lauren looked absolutely horrified. Several guests openly stared at me, waiting, guessing, and anticipating. What would the wife do? What would the humiliated woman do? Will she cry? Will she leave? Will she cause a scene? Michael clearly expected one of those outcomes, because when he finally glanced down at me, he looked completely relaxed, confident, and victorious, as if he had already won. However, what he saw was something he never could have anticipated. I was smiling. Not a laugh, not a dramatic smirk, just a perfectly composed smile. The exact moment Michael noticed that smile, confusion flashed across his face. He didn't understand. How could he? He believed I was the only person in the room without a plan. Slowly I stood up. Every single pair of eyes followed me as I moved. The room was so quiet I could hear my own footsteps. One step, and another. I walked toward the stage, toward Michael, toward Sabrina, and toward the end of my marriage. Neither of them moved. Both looked completely uncertain. For months they had been controlling the narrative. Now suddenly they didn't know what was going to happen next.
I walked up the steps. Michael lowered the microphone.
"Christine," he said, his voice carrying a tension I hadn't heard all evening. I reached into my purse. Several guests leaned forward, watching and waiting. Time seemed to stop in the ballroom. Then I pulled out the envelope. The envelope Rebecca had given me weeks ago, prepared specifically for this exact moment. Michael frowned. "What is that?" I looked right into his eyes. The eyes I had trusted for 35 years. The eyes that had lied to me, and the eyes that were now filled with complete uncertainty. And then I handed him the envelope.
No speech, no screaming, no tears, just the envelope.
The entire ballroom watched. Michael stared at it, completely bewildered, before slowly opening the envelope. I will never forget the expression that took over his face. Shock. Pure, unadulterated shock. All of his confidence vanished in an instant. The colour drained completely from his face, and his hands began to shake. For several long seconds, he just stared at the papers, unable to speak, unable to move, unable to process what had just happened. Finally, he looked up, his voice cracking as he managed to say, "Christine." For the first time all night, he looked absolutely terrified. I calmly took the microphone from his hand. The room remained dead silent. Every single guest was waiting, listening, witnessing the exact moment Michael Ferguson lost complete control. I looked out at the crowd, then at my husband, then at Sabrina, and finally, I spoke. Since Michael chose tonight to introduce an important new chapter in his life, I paused, letting the silence deepen. I figured this would be the perfect time to introduce the next chapter of mine. Nobody moved. Nobody spoke. I continued. Those documents are divorce papers. A wave of shock crashed through the entire ballroom. Gasps, whispers, and stunned expressions broke out everywhere. Michael looked completely defeated. For months he had viewed me as weak, predictable, and passive. He never once imagined I might be preparing for my own future. But the biggest shock wasn't what I had already done. It was what I was about to do next. Because the divorce papers were only the beginning. Before this night was over, every single person in this ballroom was going to learn exactly who Michael Ferguson really was. The silence inside the Grand Harbour Hotel ballroom felt almost surreal. Over 100 people were frozen in place. No music, no conversation, no movement, just pure shock. Michael stared at the divorce papers, as if they had materialized out of thin air. His face remained entirely pale. For months, even years, he had lived under the illusion that he could control every single outcome. Now, for the first time, he was completely at a loss. "Christine," he whispered.
My son looked right into my eyes and chose his wealthy father-in-law over me. In a room filled with crystal chandeliers and expensive suits, Ethan Matthews said the words, "I never thought I would hear from my own flesh and blood. Richard has done more for my future than anyone else. More than anyone else. Not his mother, not the woman who raised him entirely on her own after his father passed away." As I stood there, fighting back tears, the entire room went dead silent. Right then,
the heavy doors swung open, and a silver-haired attorney walked in, carrying a leather briefcase. What happened next would permanently alter the destiny of everyone in that room. If this story touches your heart, I hope you'll stay with me until the very end. Before we continue, please take a moment to leave a like and subscribe. Stories like this remind us that we are never truly alone in our struggles. I'd also love to hear your thoughts. If your own child chose money over family, what would you do? Share your perspective in the comments below, and let me know where you're watching from and what time it is where you are. I always look forward to reading every single message. People usually think the deepest, most heartbreaking pain comes from losing a spouse. I used to think so too, until I watched my own son slowly turn into a complete stranger. My name is Brenda Matthews. At 68 years old, I never imagined I would be telling a story like this. For most of my life, I wasn't anyone famous or powerful. I wasn't wealthy. I was just an ordinary mother. And for many years, that was more than enough. Ethan was only 10 years old when my husband, Thomas Matthews, passed away. I still remember the day I had to break the news to him. That memory has never left me. The hospital room smelled of antiseptic and fear. Thomas had fought a fierce illness for nearly a year. We both tried to shield Ethan from seeing the worst of it, but children always know more than we think. When the doctor finally walked out and shook his head, it felt like the world collapsed beneath my feet. I sat by Thomas's bedside, holding his hand long after the machines went silent. Then I went home to face the hardest conversation of my life. Ethan was sitting on the living room floor, building something out of old toy cars. He looked up and smiled. "Did Dad say when he's coming home?" Even now, more than 25 years later, I can still hear that question. I sat next to him and wrapped my arms around his shoulders. When I told him his dad was gone, he stared at me for several seconds without saying a word. Then he broke down. I had never seen that kind of grief in a child before. He cried himself to sleep in my bed that night, and I stayed awake until sunrise. It wasn't just because I couldn't sleep, it was because I was terrified. Terrified of raising a young boy all by myself, terrified of failing him, and terrified of not being enough. But life doesn't stop to wait for us to heal. The bills kept coming, the mortgage still needed to be paid, groceries had to be bought, and Ethan still needed a parent. So I picked myself up and kept moving forward. Over the years, I took every job I could find. In the mornings, I worked as a receptionist at a medical clinic. In the evenings, I served tables at a local diner. On weekends, I did bookkeeping for a small business owner in town. There were weeks when I barely slept, relying entirely on coffee and sheer willpower. I remember standing in the grocery store aisle with a calculator, carefully adding up every single item before putting it into the cart. I remember cutting back on my own meals, going hungry just to ensure Ethan had the food he liked. I wore the same winter coat for nearly 10 years because buying a new one just wasn't in the budget. But I never regretted it, not once, because whenever I looked at my son, every sacrifice felt entirely worth it. Ethan was a good boy, a truly wonderful kid. He was kind, polite, and incredibly hard-working. Whenever he saw me come home exhausted, he would pitch in without even being asked. He washed the dishes, folded the laundry, and mowed lawns for the neighbors to earn a little extra pocket money. And every single Mother's Day, he made me a card by hand. I still keep every single one of them. One in particular sits in my bedside drawer, written when he was 12. In messy, uneven handwriting, he wrote at the bottom, "Mum, you are the strongest person I know." For years, whenever life got heavy, I would read those words. They reminded me of exactly why I was pushing through. As Ethan grew older, his determination only strengthened. He excelled in school. His teachers loved him, and his peers respected him. By the time he graduated high school, he had earned a scholarship to a prestigious university. I was so incredibly proud that day, I could barely stop crying. I remember sitting in the audience at his graduation ceremony. When they called his name, I stood up and clapped until my hands ached. The woman sitting next to me smiled and said, "I think everyone knows that's your son." I just smiled back and said, "Because he is my greatest achievement." And I meant it. Nothing I ever did mattered more than raising Ethan. Not my work, not my savings, nothing else. Just him. After graduation, life finally seemed to be looking up. Ethan went off to college. I kept working, but the financial strain eased up a bit. For the first time in years, I allowed myself to imagine a future. Friends encouraged me to start dating again, and some even tried to introduce me to nice men they knew. I always politely declined. It wasn't because I was unhappy. It was because my focus had always been clear. My focus was Ethan.
Looking back now, maybe that was my mistake. Maybe I spent so much time building my son's future that I forgot to build my own. But at the time, it felt like the only right choice. Every phone call from Ethan made me smile, and every visit home filled the house with laughter. He called me his best friend. He would ask for my advice on his classes, his internships, and his life. We talked about everything. Or at least, we used to.
The first real change happened during his junior year of college. It was subtle. So subtle I almost missed it. Our phone calls grew shorter. The tone of our conversations started to shift. He began talking much more about networking, status, and opportunities. These were words he had never cared about before, but suddenly they seemed all important. At first, I thought it was just a normal part of growing up. College changes people. Maturity changes people. I didn't think much of it until one night when he called to mention a young woman named Olivia. The tone in his voice when he spoke about her made me smile. I could hear the excitement, the hope, and the sense of possibility. I remember sitting in the kitchen, listening to him describe her. "Mum, she's so smart. Incredibly smart," he said. "That's wonderful," I replied. Then he added, "And her family owns several major businesses." I noticed how quickly he threw in that last detail. At the time, it seemed minor. Now, I know it was anything but. Over the next few months, Olivia's name came up in almost every conversation. Ethan sounded happy, and that was enough for me. If she made him happy, I wanted to meet her. I wanted to welcome her into our family. I had no idea that meeting Olivia also meant encountering the people who would ultimately drive a wedge between me and my son. I had no idea that a man named Richard Whitmore was about to enter our lives, or that beneath decades of silence lay a massive secret involving my late husband, Thomas. A secret powerful enough to destroy reputations, and one that would eventually force my son to choose between wealth and his own mother. When that moment came, the choice he made would completely shatter my heart. But that part of the story was still down the road. At the time, I was just a proud mother, waiting to meet the woman her son loved, believing the hardest years were behind us. I was completely wrong. The moment I met Olivia Whitmore, I instantly understood why Ethan had fallen for her. She was beautiful, confident, and highly articulate. She was the kind of young woman who commanded a room the moment she stepped inside. With long blonde hair and a bright smile, she possessed a level of poise and assurance far beyond her years. When Ethan brought her to my house for dinner, she arrived holding a homemade apple pie, a simple gesture that immediately won me over. "I wasn't sure what you liked," she said with a slightly nervous smile, "so I made this using my grandmother's recipe." I remember smiling back and telling her, "Well, then you're already family." That evening felt wonderful. The three of us sat around my small kitchen table for nearly 3 hours, talking about college, future plans, favourite books, and travel dreams. Everything felt natural and comfortable. At the end of the night, I hugged Olivia goodbye, and after she stepped outside, I whispered to Ethan, "She's a wonderful girl. Hold on to her." He beamed like a teenager, replying, "I plan to." For a while, everything seemed perfect. Their relationship grew stronger. Olivia visited often, and sometimes she would call just to chat with me. I genuinely liked her, and more importantly, she seemed to truly love Ethan. At least, that's what I believed then. A few months later, Ethan asked the question that would change the course of everything. "Mom, would you like to meet Olivia's parents?" I smiled and said, "Of course I would." The excitement in his voice should have made me happy, but instead, for reasons I couldn't quite name, a strange sense of unease washed over me. Maybe it was intuition. Whatever it was, I couldn't shake it. 2 weeks later, I met Richard Whitmore, and from the very first second, I knew he didn't care for me. Dinner was arranged at a high-end country club just outside of Columbus, the kind of place where the initiation fees alone probably cost more than my first car. I remember walking in and immediately feeling entirely out of place. The lobby featured polished marble floors, towering crystal chandeliers, and artwork that likely cost more than my entire house. Everything seemed designed to remind visitors just how wealthy the members were. When Ethan introduced us, Richard shook my hand, though technically his fingers barely brushed against mine. His smile never reached his eyes. "Brenda," he said, "not Mrs. Matthews. No mention of it being nice to finally meet me. Just Brenda, as if my name itself didn't command any basic respect." His wife, Margaret Whitmore, seemed friendlier, or at least appeared so on the surface. She kept a pleasant smile, complimented my outfit, and asked polite questions. Still, everything carried a heavily rehearsed, superficial feel. Every phrase seemed carefully calculated.
The entire evening felt incredibly strange. Whenever I spoke, Richard seemed entirely detached, but whenever Ethan spoke, Richard listened with intense focus, especially when the topic turned to business. I quickly learned that Richard owned several companies across Ohio, spanning commercial real estate, construction, and investment firms. His wealth was substantial, and he clearly enjoyed reminding people of it. Every story he told eventually circled back to his own success.
And every conversation became a discussion about money, influence, or status. At one point, he gestured to a photo on the wall showing him standing next to a governor. "I've spent years building relationships with key people," he said, looking directly at Ethan. "Success isn't just about talent, it's about knowing the right people." Ethan nodded, his eyes filled with absolute admiration. I noticed it immediately, and I didn't like it. The son I raised was ambitious, but he had never been easily infatuated by wealth. Never. Yet during that dinner, I saw something shifting. A subtle, dangerous change was taking place. Richard had a way of making money feel like the ultimate measure of a person's worth, and Ethan was buying into it. Over the following year, the Whitmore family became deeply woven into Ethan's life. Olivia graduated, Ethan graduated, and they got engaged shortly after. I was thrilled for them, but I also noticed Ethan was spending far more time with Richard. Golf outings, business dinners, networking events, and private meetings. Richard treated Ethan like a future investment, a project he could mold into exactly what he wanted. And Ethan seemed incredibly eager for that validation. One afternoon, I invited Ethan to lunch. We met at a small diner we had patronized for years, the place where I used to take him after his Little League games, and where we celebrated scholarships and birthdays. As we sat in our usual booth, I noticed he spent most of the meal checking his phone, something he never used to do. Finally, I asked the question that had been weighing on me. "Are you happy, Ethan?" He looked surprised. "Of course. Why do you ask?" I told him. "You just seem like a different person lately." He laughed it off. "Mom, people grow up. I'm doing great. You don't need to worry about me." The words weren't unkind, but there was a distinct layer of distance behind them. A wall. For the first time in my life, I felt like I couldn't completely reach my own son. The wedding preparations moved incredibly fast. The Whitmores insisted on paying for everything. The venue, the catering, the decor. All of it. When I offered to contribute what I could, Richard dismissed it instantly. "There's no need for that." The tone carried no warmth. It felt like a brush-off, as if he couldn't imagine me offering anything meaningful. For Ethan's sake, I tried to overlook it, but the red flags kept appearing. Small moments that seemed minor at first began to add up. During a family gathering one evening, I accidentally overheard Richard talking to a few guests in the hallway. They were discussing Ethan. "He has potential," Richard said. "Potential?" someone asked. "Absolutely. The kid just needs the right environment." "The kid? Not Ethan. Not my future son-in-law. Just the kid." Then someone asked about his family background. Richard offered a soft chuckle. "I suppose every success story has to start somewhere." The group laughed softly along with him. I froze in the hallway. For a second I wanted to turn around and walk away, but instead I kept listening. One of the guests asked where Ethan's father used to work. Before anyone else could speak, Richard answered, "I don't really recall." A strange expression crossed his face. Just for a second, but I caught it. A flash of something shifted in his eyes. It wasn't uncertainty. It was recognition. The reaction was so brief, I almost convinced myself I had misread it. Almost. But on my drive home that night, I couldn't stop thinking about it. Richard knew something. I didn't know what it was, but I was certain he knew. Because the moment Thomas's name was brought up, Richard's entire demeanor had changed. The next morning, I pulled out an old photo album filled with memories from another life. Family vacations, school events, birthdays, anniversaries. Then I found a photograph of Thomas standing alongside two other men at a business function nearly 30 years ago. I stared at the photo, and my heart rate slowly began to accelerate. One of the men looked incredibly familiar. Younger, leaner, but absolutely unmistakable. It was Richard Whitmore. I sat there staring at the image for a long time, completely mystified. Thomas had never mentioned being friends with Richard, not once in all our years together. Yet there they were, standing side by side, smiling as if they knew each other well. The discovery brought far more questions than answers. Why did Richard pretend he didn't know my husband? Why did he act like a complete stranger when we first met? And most importantly, what was he hiding? I had no idea that those questions would eventually unravel everything. At the time, I thought the biggest challenge ahead was simply adjusting to my son's new lifestyle. I didn't realize the past was quietly preparing to resurface, bringing up decades-old secrets about Thomas, about Richard, and a truth that would ultimately force Ethan to make a choice that would leave me entirely heartbroken. Months after finding that old photograph of Thomas and Richard, I received an invitation from the Whitmore family for a private dinner at their estate. Not their home, their estate. That was the exact word printed on the heavy cardstock. The Whitmores loved reminding everyone exactly how wealthy they were. By then, Ethan and Olivia had set a wedding date, and the upcoming marriage had become the centre of everyone's universe. Every conversation revolved around venues, guest lists, floral arrangements, and future plans. I did everything I could to be supportive, but something felt different now. The closer Ethan got to the Whitmores, the further away he seemed to drift from me. I kept telling myself I was just imagining things, that I was just struggling to adjust to the natural changes of my son growing up. Still, the feeling simply wouldn't go away. The dinner arrived on a crisp Saturday in autumn. I drove nearly 40 minutes to reach the Whitmore property. The moment the gates opened, it felt like entering an entirely different world. The driveway wound through acres of perfectly manicured grounds. Fountains sparkled under carefully placed lights, and luxury vehicles lined the circular entry. The house itself looked more like a private resort than a family home. Pulling my modest sedan up among a row of expensive cars made me feel instantly self-conscious, and I hated that feeling. I had spent a lifetime teaching Ethan that a person's worth isn't measured by money. Yet standing there, before even walking through the front door, I felt entirely judged. A valet opened my door. "Welcome, ma'am." I thanked him and walked toward the entrance. Inside, everything was immaculate. Polished marble, crystal fixtures, and artwork likely worth more than my annual income. The rooms were filled with guests, corporate executives, local politicians, and wealthy investors. Everyone seemed to know Richard Whitmore, and everyone seemed impressed by him. I quickly spotted Ethan in the crowd, and seeing him instantly softened my heart. Regardless of the distance growing between us, he was still my boy, the same child who used to run into my arms after school. He smiled when he saw me. "Mom, you made it." I hugged him tightly. Of course I did. For a moment, everything felt normal. Then Richard appeared. "Brenda." There was that tone again, superficially polite, but inherently dismissive. "Richard," I nodded. "Glad you could make it," he said, though it sounded like a structural obligation rather than actual hospitality. Before I could even respond, his attention shifted as a wealthy donor walked into the room. Clearly that person was more important. Dinner was served shortly after. Guests conversed, servers moved with trays of expensive appetizers, and the talk centered largely around investments and business opportunities. I tried my best to engage, but most people looked right past me. A few offered polite smiles, but the moment they realized I wasn't part of their social circle, their interest vanished completely. I wasn't surprised. What truly hurt was watching Ethan slowly adapt to that environment. He laughed at jokes he would have found entirely unamusing years ago, nodded eagerly whenever wealthy men offered advice, and seemed utterly determined to prove he belonged there. When it was time to eat, everyone moved into a massive dining room. The table took up nearly the entire length of the space, with at least 20 people seated. The place cards had been meticulously arranged, and as I searched for my seat, I found it at the very far end of the long table, practically the maximum distance away from Ethan and Olivia. At first, I thought it was a mistake. Then I noticed where Richard was sitting, right in the center. Naturally, Ethan was next to Olivia,
directly beside Richard. The key figures occupied the middle section, while the less important guests filled the edges, and I was placed at the absolute tail end. The message was unmistakable. I sat down quietly, telling myself not to overreact, that maybe there was a practical reason for the seating arrangement.
But within the first 15 minutes, Richard cleared up any doubts I had. The conversation turned toward education, with one guest mentioning his son's acceptance into a prominent business school, and another speaking proudly of a daughter-in-law school. Eventually, someone asked about Ethan's upbringing. Before Ethan could even open his mouth, Richard spoke up. "Ethan's success is remarkable," he said with a smile, "especially considering how incredibly humble his background is." A soft chuckle rippled around the table, and my stomach tightened. A humble background. What a neat phrase to describe the years of struggle, years of sacrifice, and the days I worked myself to near exhaustion just to ensure Ethan had opportunities. I glanced toward my son, waiting for him to say something, waiting for him to defend me. He didn't. Instead, he offered an awkward smile and quickly changed the subject. That hurt far more than Richard's comment. Far more. As the dinner continued, the subtle slights kept coming. Richard described business success as the ultimate divider between winners and average people. Margaret talked about high society circles, and guests discussed vacation homes and private clubs. Every topic seemed designed to remind people of exactly where they ranked, and I was firmly at the bottom. At one point, a woman sitting across from me asked what I did before retiring. "I worked multiple jobs while raising my son," I replied. She offered a polite smile and said, "How admirable," though her tone sounded entirely like pity rather than respect. Feeling emotionally drained, I excused myself from the table for a few minutes to catch my breath. I wandered down the hallway looking for the restroom, and as I turned a corner, I heard voices coming from a nearby study. The door wasn't fully closed, and I recognized Richard's voice instantly, followed by Ethan's. I froze. My instinct told me to walk away, but instead, I stood there and listened. "I just want everything to go smoothly," Ethan said. "It will," Richard replied, "as long as there are no unnecessary distractions." There was a pause, then Ethan sighed. "My mother means well." Richard chuckled softly. "Good intentions aren't always enough, Ethan." Another pause followed, and then came the sentence that changed everything. The words I will never forget as long as I live. Ethan laughed quietly and said, "To be honest, sometimes it's just embarrassing having her around people like this. She just doesn't understand how things work at this level." It felt like a physical blow to my chest. The world seemed to stop moving. I waited for him to correct himself, to explain, to soften the statement. Instead, he just let the words hang there, and Richard laughed, and Ethan laughed right along with him. I could barely breathe. My son, the boy I had sacrificed everything for, the child who once called me the strongest person he knew, was now speaking about me as an embarrassment and an inconvenience. Before they could see me, I bayed away from the door. Tears filled my eyes, but I refused to let them fall. Not here, not in that house, and not where Richard Whitmore could derive any satisfaction from seeing my pain. I walked outside and stood under the cold night sky for a few minutes, staring into the darkness, trying to calm my racing heart and make sense of how everything had changed so dramatically. Then another thought entered my mind, something Richard had said during that conversation. Unnecessary distractions? The phrase bothered me because it didn't sound like a comment about my social standing. It sounded like a warning, as if something was happening behind the scenes that I wasn't supposed to know about. For the first time, I began to suspect that Ethan wasn't the only one keeping secrets. Richard Whitmore was hiding something too, something involving my late husband. Something connected to that old photograph, and whatever it was significant enough to make him incredibly nervous. I didn't know it yet, but I was standing on the edge of a truth that would completely alter the fate of everyone involved. Following that dinner at the Whitmore estate, I barely slept. Every time I closed my eyes, I heard Ethan's voice over and over again. Sometimes it's just embarrassing having her around people like this. The words repeated endlessly in my mind, like an open wound. For days, I tried to convince myself it was a misunderstanding, that I was taking it out of context, or that Ethan was just stressed. A mother is always best at making excuses for her child, especially when the truth cuts deep. But deep down, I knew exactly what I had heard. The weeks that followed brought very little comfort. If anything, the distance between Ethan and me became even more pronounced. Our calls grew shorter. His visits became rare, and whenever I tried to discuss anything personal, he quickly redirected the conversation to work, Olivia, or the future. It was always about the future, never the past, never family, never us. Then out of nowhere, he invited me to lunch. Part of me hoped he wanted to talk about what had happened at the estate, that maybe he realized how much he had changed and wanted to repair our relationship. I arrived at the restaurant 15 minutes early, a modern, upscale steakhouse downtown, far more expensive than any place we used to go. When Ethan arrived, he seemed entirely preoccupied, his phone buzzing constantly. Throughout the meal, he kept glancing at his messages. Finally, I decided to address things directly. "Ethan," he looked up. "Yeah, Mom," I asked him. "Are you truly happy?" He frowned, looking annoyed. "Why do you keep asking me that?" I told him. "Because you just don't seem like yourself lately." His shoulders tensed up immediately. "I've changed, Mom. Everyone changes." The frustration in his voice caught me off guard. I stared at him, realizing that the person sitting across from me felt like a complete stranger, not the boy I raised. He seemed cold, defensive, and completely detached. "I just miss you," I said softly. A flicker of emotion crossed his face. Maybe guilt, maybe irritation, but it vanished just as quickly. "I'm busy, Mom. I need you to understand that. I finally have real opportunities here." I stayed silent as he leaned back in his chair. Richard has introduced me to people who can completely transform my entire career. There it was again. Richard. Every conversation always led right back to Richard Whitmore. I forced a smile and said, "I'm glad things are going well." "They are," he replied defensively, as if he constantly needed to convince himself his choices were right. The conversation never recovered, and as lunch ended, he gave me a brief, formal hug that carried none of the warmth we used to share. Watching him walk away, I wondered where my son had gone. 2 weeks later, I got my answer. The Whitmores hosted another gathering, smaller this time, just close family members. Olivia personally invited me, and though my instinct told me to stay home, I wanted to support my son, so I went. The evening started pleasantly enough, but mid-dinner, Richard asked Ethan to step into his study. The request seemed casual, but something in Richard's tone made me instantly alert. 20 minutes passed, and neither man returned. Excusing myself from the table, I walked down the hallway toward the study. As I approached, I heard raised voices, and then I heard my name. I stopped immediately. The door was slightly cracked, revealing Richard standing by his desk, with Ethan sitting across from him. Several documents spread out between them. "I need to know you are fully committed, Ethan," Richard said. "I am. I told you I am," Ethan replied. Richard crossed his arms. "There can't be any distractions." My stomach tightened as Richard delivered the words that shattered everything. "If you're going to be part of this family, you need to think like this family. That means understanding priorities. The future we are offering you cannot be limited by obligations that no longer serve a purpose." I felt physically sick. Ethan stared at the documents. "What exactly do you want me to do?" Richard sat down slowly. "I'm asking you to put your future first. Between your mother and this opportunity, which one matters more?" A dead silence fell over the room. Even standing in the hallway, I could feel the immense weight of that question. My heart pounded as I prayed, desperately hoping the son I raised would stand up and say no. Instead, Ethan lowered his gaze and said the words that destroyed any remaining hope I had. "I'm building a future with Olivia." Richard smiled. Good answer. The pain was immediate and sharp, a physical ache in my chest. I wanted to walk into that room and demand an explanation from the boy who used to cry himself to sleep in my arms after losing his father. But I didn't. I just stood there as Richard pushed the papers forward. "This is what successful people do, Ethan. They make hard choices." My son picked up a pen and signed the documents, page after page. Then Richard stood up and shook his hand. It didn't look like a family moment. It looked entirely like a business transaction, an agreement that somehow involved sacrificing me. I quietly slipped away before they could discover me, my legs shaking as I sat on a bench outside the house. When Ethan eventually came out to find me, I forced a pleasant expression. "Just needed some fresh air," I said. "Are you okay, Mom?" he asked. The question felt almost comical. "Okay." No, I wasn't. But I wasn't ready to confront him yet, so I just nodded. He looked incredibly relieved, as if he desperately wanted to believe everything was normal. The rest of the evening passed in a complete blur, and I barely remember the drive home. Standing in my living room, staring at Thomas's photograph, I said out loud to the empty house, Your son chose them. Saying it out loud made the cruel reality impossible to deny. The next morning, after a completely sleepless night, I opened an old address book and found the number for Daniel Coleman, the attorney who had worked with Thomas years ago and still sent me holiday cards. When he answered, I simply said, "Daniel, I think it's finally time." There was a long pause before he calmly replied, "I've been wondering when you'd call." 3 days later, I met Daniel Coleman at his office downtown. The place hadn't changed at all in 25 years. The same polished wood, the same quiet atmosphere that made every conversation feel significant. Walking into the reception area, a wave of nervousness hit me. Reopening the past meant uncovering things that had been locked away for a reason. But I was ready for the truth, no matter the cost. Daniel, now in his late 70s with entirely white hair, greeted me warmly. His eyes were still incredibly sharp. "Come on in, Brenda," he said, leading me into an office that smelled of old books and coffee. Photographs lined the wall, including a few featuring Thomas. Daniel noticed me looking. "He was a good man," he said softly. "The best," I replied. We sat down, and Daniel leaned forward. "Are you certain you're ready for this, Brenda?" I told him yes. He stood up, went to a locked filing cabinet, and pulled out a thick, weathered folder with yellowed edges. Placing it on the desk, he kept his hand on top of it. Thomas instructed me to keep these secure. He believed that one day they might become incredibly important. My heart hammered against my ribs. "What's inside, Daniel?" He took a deep breath, opened the folder, and revealed dozens of documents, contracts, and financial statements. Daniel slid one document across the desk. "Do you recognize this company name?" I looked down, my eyes widening. The name was deeply familiar. Thomas had mentioned it briefly years ago when Ethan was just a child. "Yes," I said. Daniel nodded. "Thomas helped build this company. He was one of the original founders." I was completely speechless. It made absolutely no sense. If Thomas had founded a successful company, why did we struggle so badly after he died? Why did I have to work multiple jobs for years? Daniel seemed to anticipate my confusion. "Brenda, before Thomas got sick, he sold most of his public shares. But he didn't sell everything. He retained a significant ownership stake through a private structure." I stared at the pages, the legal jargon blurring before my eyes as my pulse drummed in my ears. "How significant?" I asked. Daniel hesitated before answering. "Extremely significant." The office grew entirely quiet as my entire reality began to shift. "Why didn't he tell me?" I whispered. Daniel's expression softened. "Because he ran out of time, Brenda. He intended to explain everything once certain legal matters were finalized." "What legal matters?" I asked, noticing his hesitation. "Richard Whitmore?" Daniel said, the name sending a chill straight through me. Richard and Thomas weren't just acquaintances. They were business partners. Early projects involved both of them. Then why did Richard pretend he didn't know him? Daniel's face grew serious. "That is the exact question I've been asking myself for years." He opened another section of the folder, revealing copies of letters Thomas had written directly to Richard months before getting sick. The tone was filled with an unusual anger, with Thomas accusing Richard of breaching prior agreements and withholding information. Daniel then opened a sealed envelope covered in Thomas's handwriting. Seeing his script made my breath catch. Daniel pulled out a single page and handed it to me. In the center, a line was underlined in Thomas's unmistakable handwriting. "If anything ever happens to me, do not trust Richard Whitmore." The words sat right there on the page, written years before Ethan ever met Olivia, years before the Whitmores entered our lives. Looking up, I saw the gravity in Daniel's face. He had known something was wrong for decades, and now, for the first time, I understood why. The stakes were suddenly far larger than a son choosing a wealthy father-in-law. This was about a decades-old betrayal, and Richard Whitmore had spent years pretending the past didn't exist, because the truth had the power to completely destroy him. For nearly 2 weeks after meeting with Daniel, I kept everything to myself, carrying the weight of Thomas's warning completely alone. Meanwhile, Daniel continued reviewing old corporate records, tracking down former associates, his expression growing more concerned by the day. Then Ethan called, his voice unusually cheerful. "Mum, we'd love for you to attend a charity gala next month. You're a family after all." The response sounded practiced, but I agreed to go, partly to support him, but mostly to observe the Whitmores closely. Daniel had recently discovered that the foundation hosting the gala was connected to several entities he was currently investigating. The gala took place at one of the most expensive hotels in Columbus, with crystal chandeliers, live musicians, and hundreds of wealthy guests in designer clothing. I arrived alone and spotted Ethan and Olivia near the entrance looking absolutely flawless. "You look wonderful, Mum," Ethan said, hugging me. Olivia greeted me warmly as well. A moment later, Richard walked over, a superficial smile plastered across his face. "Brenda," he said in his usual dismissive tone, guiding me toward a group of wealthy donors. "Everyone, this is Brenda Matthews," Richard announced, Ethan's mother. Brenda has lived in a small town outside of Columbus most of her life, working multiple jobs while raising Ethan. The guests offered polite smiles, but I saw exactly what Richard was doing. He wasn't introducing me, he was defining me, reducing my life to a humble backstory to serve as a prop for Ethan's success. One donor remarked, "Well, you certainly raised an ambitious son." Richard smiled and added, "Fortunately, Ethan has moved far beyond his beginnings." A few people chuckled, and my stomach tightened. The insult was meticulously disguised as a compliment. I glanced at Ethan. He heard it, but once again he said absolutely nothing. His silence hurt worse than any insult. Throughout the evening, the subtle slights continued. Whenever I tried to contribute to a conversation, executives politely redirected the topic, treating my input as worthless. People measured value entirely by wealth, status, and influence. Richard moved through the ballroom like a king, enjoying every second. Then something completely unexpected happened. Standing near a display table, a voice behind me called out, "Brenda Matthews." I turned to see a well-dressed, silver-haired man in his 70s, staring at me in shock. "My goodness," he said, walking closer. "You probably don't remember me. Victor Reynolds." The name hit me instantly. Thomas had mentioned Victor many times as a trusted colleague. "Victor," I said as we shared a brief hug. His expression quickly shifted to one of genuine concern. "What are you doing here, Brenda? Does Richard know you're here?" I frowned. Of course he does. Victor stared at me in disbelief, glanced across the room at Richard and Ethan, and then looked back at me, delivering 4 words that changed everything. "The original owner." My pulse quickened instantly. "I don't understand, Victor." He looked surprised by my confusion. "You mean nobody told you?" Before he could explain, a voice interrupted us. "Victor." Richard Whitmore had appeared, and for the first time since I had known him, I saw genuine fear in his eyes. Only for a split second, but it was there. The 2 men stared at each other, neither smiling. "I didn't realize you 2 knew each other," Richard said, his jaw visibly tightening. Victor looked directly at him and replied, "Oh, we go way back. Some history is very difficult to erase." The silence that followed felt dangerous. Richard quickly recovered his composure, but I had seen enough. There was a connection here, a connection to Thomas and a connection to me, and whatever this secret was, Richard was terrified of it. Walking out of the gala that night, one thing became painfully clear. Daniel was right. The deeper we dug, the more nervous Richard became. And nervous people make mistakes. Soon enough, the truth he had hidden for decades would finally come to light. 3 days after the gala, I met Victor Reynolds at a quiet diner on the edge of town, a location he insisted on to avoid any corporate onlookers. The request alone signaled how critical this conversation was. When I arrived, Victor looked visibly unsettled, as if carrying a heavy burden. The moment I sat down, he didn't waste any time. "Thank you for coming, Brenda." I looked at him directly. "I need answers, Victor. What did you mean when you called me the original owner?" Victor leaned back, letting out a long breath. "The truth is complicated, Brenda," I told him. "I've been speaking with Daniel Coleman, so I'm moving faster than you think." Victor nodded, sliding several copied documents across the table. The company name on the papers matched the one Daniel had shown me, the firm Thomas helped found. Victor tapped the front page. This is where it all began. The document listed the original founders: Thomas Matthews, Victor Reynolds, 2 others, and Richard Whitmore. Seeing their names together sent a chill through me. Back then none of us were wealthy, Victor explained. But we were ambitious, especially Thomas. He was a visionary. Victor's voice grew cold. Most people believe Richard built his empire entirely on his own. He didn't. Without Thomas, Richard would never be the man he is today. Those words carried massive weight, shattering the image Richard had projected for decades. Victor opened another file containing old agreements and ownership structures. The trouble started when Thomas got sick, Victor said quietly. While Thomas was fighting for his life, Richard was fighting for control. After the diagnosis, several ownership structures were altered.
I frowned. Altered? Legally? Victor looked up, his hesitation telling me everything. Not entirely legally, Brenda. Richard profited immensely from Thomas's illness.
I sat back in absolute shock. For years I believed our financial struggles were just a matter of tragic circumstances. Now, a much darker reality was surfacing. Victor showed me correspondence where the once friendly partnership completely deteriorated into conflict, with Thomas accusing Richard of breaching agreements and withholding information months before he passed away. Brenda, do you know why Richard looked so terrified when he saw me at the gala? Victor asked. I shook my head. Because I know exactly where the original ownership records are kept. The records Richard wishes had completely vanished. My heart skipped a beat. For decades, Richard had built an empire on a foundation that didn't entirely belong to him. It belonged to Thomas. And after Thomas, it belonged to me. There is enough evidence in those records to make Richard do absolutely anything to keep this a secret, Victor warned. And when he realizes Daniel is reopening these files, he will panic. A man who has spent decades protecting a secret like this really goes down quietly. A week after meeting with Victor, Ethan unexpectedly showed up at my house. The moment I opened the door, I knew something was terribly wrong. My son looked completely exhausted, with dark circles under his eyes and tense shoulders. "Can we talk, Mum?" he asked. We sat down at the kitchen table, and after a heavy silence, Ethan broke it. "You've been meeting with Daniel Coleman." It wasn't a question, it was a statement. My stomach tightened, realizing Richard had found out. "Yes, I have," I replied calmly. Ethan leaned forward, his voice filled with intense frustration. "Mum, what are you doing? Richard sees someone is trying to stir up issues that should have stayed buried long ago." The irony was palpable. Issues that should have stayed buried. "I'm just looking into some old matters regarding your father," I said softly. Ethan rubbed his face. "Mum, please stop. Stop whatever it is you're doing. Richard says this could end up hurting a lot of people. Maybe some things are just better left alone." I leaned back in my chair, staring at my son. I realized with an aching certainty that he hadn't come here out of concern for me. He had come to protect his own future and status. "Are you afraid, Ethan?" I asked. He looked away, unable to meet my eyes. "Ethan, tell me the real reason you're here." He finally spoke. "Richard said this could ruin everything. And honestly, Richard has given me opportunities that Dad never could have given me." The statement landed like a physical slap. For several seconds, I just stared at him in disbelief. I slowly stood up from the table. "Do you know what your father actually gave you, Ethan? He gave you his name. He gave you his values. He gave you a family. And he spent his final days trying to secure something he believed would help you one day." Ethan looked completely confused, having absolutely no idea what Daniel and Victor had uncovered about his father's true legacy. Then Ethan reached into his briefcase and placed a document on the table. "It's just a legal release," he said, his voice tightening. "It confirms you won't pursue any claims related to past business matters. It protects everyone, Mum." The truth was finally out. Richard wasn't just nervous. He was utterly terrified. Terrified enough to send my own son as a messenger to pressure me, I pushed the document right back across the table. Ethan, if what Richard built was completely honest, he has absolutely nothing to fear. Think very carefully about the side you're choosing to stand on. Ethan picked up the document, placed it back in his briefcase, and stood up. I've already made my choice. The words cut deep, confirming what I already knew. My son had chosen Richard Whitmore over his own family in the truth. As the front door closed behind him, a strange sense of clarity washed over me. The waiting was over. The uncertainty was gone, and now the consequences would have to follow. A few minutes later, my phone rang. It was Daniel, his voice urgent. Brenda, what happened? After a brief pause, I told him exactly what had transpired. Daniel delivered the words that changed the course of everything. I think we're ready.